For the majority, religion plays a large part of our lives. Even for those that aren't particularly religious, society is shaped by it. Classic example, Sundays. Sundays, by many, is considered a day of relaxation, and we see it in our own high street. Shops open late and close early, all to do with Sunday trading laws and the general belief that Sundays are associated with rest. The term the Sabbath can also have several meanings, depending upon the church that people follow. As modern Western Christianity was the more popular in the UK at the time the railway was founded, it is this that we will focus on. The Roman Catholic Church, from its early years, observed Sundays, or what they call the Sabbath, as the day of rest and worship. This also spilled into the Protestant faith when they split from the Catholic Church in the 16th century. Workers were encouraged to down tools and worship, with recreational activities, leisure and pleasure activities actively discouraged. The observance of this day made it to law both in 1661 and 1690. And while not working on the Sabbath was not legally binding, the law gave guidance to employers and encouraged them to close for non-essential purposes. But when the railways arrived, the discussion of Sunday running came into question. Is the running of trains classed as essential? Surprisingly, the general view was no, and at first railways, especially those in the north, simply closed. But it wasn't long before perishable goods started to suffer, as some railways were open and backlogs began to appear. In Scotland, while many churches were in agreement about the rules of the Sabbath, one church in particular took it to another level. The Free Church is a splinter church group that broke from the Church of Scotland in 1843. The Free Church didn't agree that local landowners had the power to choose ministers, and they had good reason to be angry, as it was these same landowners that had taken over land belonging to many Highland clans. The displaced clans were quickly evicted, with many turning to the Church of Scotland. The Free Church refused to accept pastors associated with the landowners and created a very successful church that is still going today. The Free Church had a literal view of the Sabbath, and due to the previous acts, and as more railways wanted to run on Sundays, especially with freight, the Free Church doubled down and tried to lobby its own flock and in Parliament with multiple law readings. But the railways fought back. When the railways won the right to move post, they were obligated in getting that post to its destination on time. This is why for over 100 years the post train was one of the most important trains in Britain. The lack of Sunday running though was causing a problem, and stations were getting backlogged with uncollected post. The government had to eventually intervene and passed a bill giving the Postmaster General sweeping powers to govern and in some cases commandeer a train to run the post, even on the Sundays. The disregard of the Sabbath enraged the church, and the post came under criticism. However, the law was stuck, and the first trains to run on Sundays were postal. The church, though, was still adamant, no freight, no passengers. And this worked for a while, but a scandal rocked the movement. The Duchess of Sutherland had received news in the early hours of Sunday morning that her father was gravely ill, and she sped straight for the station. Although the message had gotten to her by a messenger, the only way to travel quickly was by the train. The Duchess begged and pleaded the Scottish Central to give her a seat on the mail train. She would even sit on the bags if she had to. But the crew refused, and while the post was essential, they saw the movements of a passenger, even with one with an agenda such as hers, a pleasure trip, and as such, a sin. The poor woman was refused, and as such lost the chance to say goodbye to her father. The church stood with the crew, but the Duchess had taken pen to paper, and groups, especially those against the restrictions on the Sabbath, were quick to jump in. The extra work the railways were getting was also adding more weight to running on Sundays. Crews were being subjected to more work hours just to clear the work, and accidents due to fatigue were rife. By the end of the 1840s, hundreds of men were forced to be working Sundays, mainly due to the poverty line. The men needed money, and while many disagreed working on Sundays, it was paid work. The railways, however, were accommodating and did allow the men to worship, with some only working one Sunday in 5. The movement of these trains ignited debate once again about moving passengers. The crew were working anyway, and there was some debate that the railway actually brought communities and people to the churches. But the Sabbatarians resisted. There was a serious belief that the journeys would be for recreation, something that was an absolute no. However, one group of people brought up a very important point: the navvies. On a Sunday, with there being no work, the navvies would engage in recreation, and they made a very good point. If they were walking or visiting parks, promenades and the like, without being called sinful, then why is recreation on a train any different? Is reading a book learning or sin? And why do Sundays have to be so dull? Nothing in the Bible says it has to be. It brought up the topic of opening museums and areas where people could relax, but they needed the railways to do it. In 1842, the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway announced 2 trains to run on Sundays for the first time for passengers. They had consulted other railways for feedbacks, and the result had been positive. Despite protests, the motion was approved with the board. The first passengers were subjected to a torrent of words as they disembarked, while the protesters with money were encouraged to buy shares. While this may sound weird, the shares gave the owners rights to go to meetings to where their grievances could be aired, and it was thought that with enough influence and pressure, the runs would be scrapped. This ultimately was doomed to fail, as the majority shareholders were more interested in the bottom line than the Sabbath, and would often vote in proxy. So while the Scottish meetings would be hot on the topic, it fell on deaf ears and it got vetoed every time. The Sabbatarians got their chance 4 years later during the market collapse with a new railway board, and were able to stop the trains running in exchange for their support. Despite the public being in favour of Sunday running and the railway rallied, the Edinburgh to Glasgow Railway stuck to being closed, as did several railways around Scotland. However, by 1850, the earlier passion felt on both sides was beginning to calm. The church relaxed its stance on its literal meaning of the Sabbath, while the railways recognised its mistake of running a regular service without consideration. The Caledonian Railway and the North British Railways led the way with a relaxed Sunday timetable, with other railways following suit, and focus was put on ensuring these services paved the way for the future. Much to the stricter members of the movement's anger, Sunday trains were now back and growing. Churchman and traditionalist Norman MacLeod was a man dedicated to the traditional beliefs. He was furious that the news on the Sabbath had been relaxed and wanted to go back to how it used to be. The North British Railway at the same time wanted to introduce a new goods train. Unlike perishable and essential goods, these regular trains would now carry general goods and provisions that could easily be carried midweek. Norman and his flock saw it as the ultimate insult. Not only was the railway now making a profit from this, but the goods would actively encourage businesses to open and people to work, as they would have to be available to receive them. The matter was brought up at a meeting of the United Presbyterian Church. The church leaders singled out the railway, accusing them of profit over damnation, and people loyal to the cause lobbied the railway to stop, with the railway ignoring their pleas. The Glasgow and Edinburgh Railway Company had remained free from the Sunday running, but when the North British Railway announced a merger, considering they openly adopted Sunday running, the Sabbatarians were concerned that they were going to lose its only line it had successfully lobbied for. At first, the railways assured them no Sunday running, but the ink wasn't even dry on the contract before it was announcing the Sunday trains. Meetings and demonstrations were held. People took to the streets, lamenting the loss of workers' souls. All the while, the railway quietly waited. And on the 3rd of September 1865, Sunday running on the Edinburgh to Glasgow route started again. MacLeod refused to back down. On the November, he led a 4-hour sermon on the subject and stood up and protested. Even in the face of the other church leaders who disagreed with his views, he demonstrated with his followers. He preached and he lobbied for the stoppage of the trains. But as the trains paved the way forward, it opened the floodgates for horse-drawn trams and other modes of transport to be run. And by the end of the year, although pockets of resistance remained, it was simply overshadowed by the general running. However, the protests were peaceful, as many refused to engage in hostilities. But while these were peaceful, there were some that took protests to the extreme. The Dingwall and Skye Railway was small by standard, and it was first sympathetic to the protesters. They opened up their station terminus at Strone Ferry to allow both workers and the locals to worship, but would refrain from running on a Sunday. The arrangement was popular, and the protesters came to respect the railway in light of the others. In 1883, the railway was awarded a contract to move fish on a Sunday. For a few extremists, this was too far, and taking matters into their own hands, they arranged to meet and protest. On the 3rd of July, the train was surrounded by hundreds as it was being loaded. The crew tried to defend the train, but it was no use, and the cargo was spoiled. The protesters, satisfied, vowed to be back the following week under the terms that the train would never ever run. The threat was taken seriously, and the following Sunday was under police guard. The protesters arrived, but many clashed with the police, with several being read the Riot Act. It was the first time that the protest had led to violence, and a royal commission was held to look at the matter. But it was clear that the movement was fighting a losing battle. More and more railways opened up on Sundays. The railways, though, understood, and even today, the majority of the network run a restricted service. For many today, Sundays is seen as a day of recreation, for relaxation and for family. I don't know about some, but some days always seem more relaxed, and it is my day to chill and just enjoy what's around me.